what's your sense of when a young person should be allowed to start specializing in the intelligences that are coming most naturally to them and about which they feel most passionate?
Well, I mean, certainly that varies by kid. That's by definition. But I think early is good. What I would argue, and I wrote a chapter for a book that was published in China a few years ago. What I would argue that is that as parents, we have an obligation to expose our kids to all intelligences, and here's why I say that first. Too often, what I think happens is we as adults have our own intelligence. Everybody has an intelligence profile, but we adults have our intelligence profile, and we channel the kids into the things at which we.
Mm, great
So if
point.
we're an artist, we probably take our kids to the museum a whole lot. If we're bodily kinesthetically talented, our kids going to be playing sports. There's merit in that, and anything that puts kids and parents together, I'm all for. But I would argue that particularly at the early years, particularly until a kid is 8 or 9, you want to make sure that kid gets exposed to lots of different intelligences. And I would say that one of the things you do, you've got this list of the 8 intelligences, and you check off where have we gone. Have we gone to the zoo? Have we gone to the art museum? Have we gone to the symphony? And give your kid that opportunity. And then what's going to happen is interest will take over. I've got a nephew who's 6 years old and he's really into hockey. Well, he's going to be a good hockey player. One of the reasons he's really into hockey, not to take anything away from him, is his dad's really into hockey, and that's wonderful. Comma, but his parents also take him to museums. They also go hiking. So I think the key thing as a parent is to give your kid exposure, and if that passion arises, it will manifest itself, and you'll see that. Now, having said that, we probably all are old enough to know kids who at 8 or 9 were zealots about this, and by 18 or 19, they've totally forgotten it. So it seems
Right.
to me providing an exposure and then cultivating, and then the kid will take the lead.
Mm. What about in this in terms of formal education? And I'll give you an example of a case here that I think applies. So we've been my team and I have been making this video on musical intelligence, and we're featuring a young artist by the name of Billie Eilish, and you may have heard of her. She's becoming extremely well known and is quite talented, and she collaborates with her brother, and they're both brilliant musicians. She's a vocalist and he's a sort of versatile musician. But the reason I bring her up is she was homeschooled. Her and her brother were homeschooled, and when they started showing like extreme interest in music, the parents allowed them to really spend the majority of their time creating music and just kind of playing around with music. And they would even say to them like, you don't have to have a bedtime if you're working on your music. You can stay up as late as you want. And so I'm sure if you were to look at like the literal time spent on the various subjects, they would have had a huge majority of that spent on musical intelligence, where if they had been in a traditional school, they would have had to probably go to bed early to wake up and get there on time. They would have had to spend the same amount of time with each subject as every other kid. And inevitably, their times developing musical intelligence would have gotten much shorter. And I'm sure they would have ended up, becoming highly talented musicians, but maybe even a little bit later.
Mhm.
So that's an example of a child really being allowed in their formal education to really spend the majority of their time focusing on the intelligence. So, I guess let me ask it this way: there really isn't until the third year of college that a student can primarily focus on what they're interested in. And in high school, there's a little bit of room for electives, but it's very limited. And then in the typical middle school and elementary school, it's a relatively templated experience for each kid. So if you could, not to not that it's this black and white, but if you could kind of choose an age or a grade where you think there should be way more opportunity to personalize than there currently is, what would you say?
Well, let me give you two thoughts on that. And the first one would be, and the woman you're describing sounds like a wonderful trajectory. and I'm sure she'll be successful, semicolon, however, comma. I'm traditional enough that I want to make sure everybody has the three R's. I mean, I'm a multiple intelligence kind of a guy, but I worry if a kid graduates from our schools without having the requisite skills. I would argue, in fact, that the pervasiveness of email and texting makes the ability to write the written word even more important
Mm.
because it's so much more rarer these days. So my first thought is the academics have to be there. My second thought, though, Nick, and I hear what you're saying about the channeling and the opportunity. I would suggest, though, that you get a different answer if you don't limit yourself to 8:30 to 3:30. And it seems to me that I use 8 or 9 years old a little earlier. And I think there comes an age where if you're a parent, it's really obvious. And that's one of the things that you can cultivate on weekends, after school, evenings, or whatever. Kids who are passionate are going to find a way. And again, I'm enough of a traditionalist. This woman's story sounds great, but I worry about somebody who has put all their eggs in the musical, the spatial, the bodily kinesthetic basket, and in fact then becomes 18 and has trouble finding a job and making a livelihood.
Fair. Totally fair. Yeah, and perhaps that general baseline that we were talking about that a person needs to reach with all of the intelligences should be pretty high. I
Mhm.
suppose it's fair to say that we should all become totally proficient writers and readers, even if our specialty is elsewhere. So yeah, that makes sense.
And let me add on that, if I might. I've been talking a lot about the personal intelligences and social emotional learning. And it seems to me that a danger, I'm not pushing against it, but a danger in letting a kid channel too much is that she may not learn grit because she's doing well at something. Many artistic endeavors and athletic endeavors aren't really team sports, they're more individual. And what I want, what I know now as an old guy, I've come to value social emotional learning, character a great deal. I want people who can work in a situation, work with people who are different than they are, who can appreciate them, who can empathize, who can do their best work. To me, that's the most important thing we can prepare kids to do in the world because we don't know what the world is going to be tomorrow.
Makes sense. I have one thought and one question. The thought is, I hear you on the grit point, although I would push back a little bit and say that I I, I think it is possible that a child finds success in something and then they just kind of want to focus on that because it comes easily to them, and therefore they don't have to really like cultivate grit. But I also think that when a person finds something that they're very good at, they tend to push themselves to the edge of what's possible with that. And at the edge is where grit becomes important to
Good
keep
point.
expanding that. So I do think that it's quite possible, and I know in myself, and as I have found things that I am good at, I've like pushed myself to the limit, and I've really found grit because the potential for how high the ceiling is like very inspiring for me. So I do think that, even if a child is something is coming easily to the child, that they can still find a way to um, dig deep and find grit and push themselves, and that will look like they're going far beyond the average person, which I suppose is great.